Everybody. This is Module 11. Last week we learned about the WIDA lesson plan. This week we are going to learn about the SIOP model. So here's our objectives for today. You are going to learn about the 8 components of the SIOP model, the goal of the SIOP model, and then you are going to explore some SIOP resources for your discussion board activity today. And I also put quite a few pictures and videos in the lesson plan. Okay, so why was the SIOP model created? As we know, there's a large achievement gap between English language learners and non-English language learners. Okay, so there's so many court cases that say that English language learners are not being adequately educated. And so the SIOP model was created to help mainstream teachers who were not technically ELL certified to effectively serve ELL students. Okay, so I want you to think of the SIOP model like a funnel, and the SIOP model basically gives ELL students access to content areas by meeting their language needs and their academic needs at the same time. So think about pouring in all of the language needs that the students have and their academic needs. And basically, when those two come together, they're able to access content area information better. So SIOP stands for Sheltered Instruction Observation Protocol, and it was developed by 3 ladies, 3 doctors, Dr. Jana, Dr. Mary, and Dr. Deborah, and they have done a lot of research on educating ELLs. I think, 2 textbooks that were written by them. You'll always see their names in ELL research. Okay, so there's 8 components, and we're going to go through each component individually. Okay, so we will start with lesson preparation. So last week we talked about the content objective and the language objective. You always want to be clear on those. What standard or what is the student to master before by the end of the lesson, and what language does the student need to master the objective? Okay, in classrooms you typically see I can statements, and that is I can statements help teachers to make sure that the objectives are written in student-friendly language. So we never want to uh, present an objective in the complex language that you would see on the Missouri Learning Standards. For example, you want the standard to be in a student-friendly form so the students can understand what their objective is. What are they going to be able to do by the end of the lesson? Also, you want to make sure that the objective is appropriate for the student and their grade level. Okay, next thing you want to do is, while you're planning to prepare the lesson, always make sure that you are aware of your students' proficiency level. Okay, and remember, when you teach, you always teach one level beyond the student's proficiency level. You want to make sure you have supplementary materials, and also you want to make sure that you keep in mind to engage all of the students' learning language domains. So listening, speaking, writing, and reading. Okay, so you want to have meaningful activities to engage them in those domains. Okay, component 2 is building background. I want you to think of background knowledge as a bridge. It's a bridge from the student's schema, meaning what they already know, to their new learning. Okay, and I'll show you a few things about background knowledge, and just think about yourself and when you're learning new things. I think it was in the second or third module we learned about the process of language learning and we compared it to when babies learn language. And we were already familiar with how babies learn language. And so comparing it to that was building on your background knowledge, building on what you already knew. And it's very important to engage students and help build background knowledge before teaching them a lesson. Okay? So never assume that the student already knows about the content. You always want to make sure you activate their background knowledge. In trying to activate their knowledge, you may learn that they know a lot about the subject or they don't really know anything about the subject. And so it helps you to gauge how much you need to teach and what direction your teaching needs to go into. Learning vocabulary is a huge part of background knowledge. So most vocabulary words for English language learners need to be taught explicitly, but some can be taught implicitly also. When students have limited vocabulary, that hinders them in the lesson, so it's not very comprehensible. So you want to make sure that they are getting access to vocabulary when activating their background knowledge, okay? And remember, we learned about vocabulary a few modules ago. Teaching vocabulary is not just saying the words. You have to help them engage with the words and the words' meaning. You want to show them, you want to have them write and use the words, actually speak and use the words. You want them to even maybe illustrate or show them examples. So this is a video that you're going to watch about background knowledge. You'll watch this on your own. And then this is a picture of a baseball diamond. And most students are somewhat familiar with baseball or kickball. They know that they go to first, second, third. And so I'm using this as an example for building background knowledge when teaching about transition words. And so when students have to order something or use transition words, using the baseball diamond and how it goes in order to teach them transition words is activating their background knowledge because they probably already know about first, second, third base, and home base. And so it'd be easier to bridge their knowledge to learning about first, second, third, or first, then, next, last. This is another video that you'll watch about background knowledge. Okay. A KWL chart is a graphic organizer that's used to figure out what the student already knows about something and then kind of have them consider what they want to learn. And then after the lesson is finished, then you will record what they learn during the lesson. So a lot of teachers use these to introduce a new unit. Some teachers use these to when they're reading a new book, when they're learning about a new subject. And some teachers actually teach the students to use KWL charts. So this is a way to get the students to think about what they already know about something. Another form of a KWL is a can-have-are chart. And then the second graphic organizer is expanded even more. Have, can, are, eat, and live. Okay, before we go on, I want you to watch this video about comprehensible input. So you will watch this video and then you'll come back to the presentation. So she is giving directions, and the first time she gives directions, it's not easy to understand because you don't know the language that she's speaking. And many English language learners experience that in our classrooms. They don't have the vocabulary, they don't know the language. And so when you give them an assignment, you give them something to do, their eyes are wide open. They don't know what to do. So comprehensible input is basically being sure and monitoring that the students actually understand the language that you're using. So input is what the student is receiving. So the student teacher has to make sure to monitor their speech and make sure that they're using speech language that is appropriate with the student's proficiency level. So if you have students who have a very low proficiency level, um, you wouldn't want to give them directions like 4-step directions. You would maybe want to start off with giving them a 1-step direction, and you would probably want to use a gesture that's making it comprehensible. They're able to understand. You also, with lower proficiency level students, you want to have slower speech. You want to enunciate clearly so they can actually hear how to use the sounds in the language. You would want to paraphrase. So if you see that they're not understanding what you said, you need to change what you said and say it a different way. So if you say, everybody line up and go to the door and no students move, they didn't understand what you said. The next thing that you can do is use smaller chunks of information. And that goes with what I was saying about 1-step directions, 2-step directions. And also, repetition is very helpful. Repeat over and over again. And the more the student hears the language, well, let me back up. You don't want to repeat the same thing over and over and over again if they're not understanding it and you don't explain it to them or make it comprehensible. You saying it over and over again is not going to change anything. But I think that means that you use familiar language, and then you have to monitor if they're able to comprehend or not. The next bullet point is really important. So if you give students an academic task, some type of an assignment to do, they need to be able to understand the directions. If they don't understand the directions, they cannot complete the task. So some techniques that you can use in your classroom, the number one technique is modeling, actually showing them what to do. And if you're showing them with the language, that makes it more comprehensible for the student. You could have visual aids in the classroom, such as anchor charts. You could do gestures. For instance, if you want them to cut something, you could do a gesture of cutting, or you could even make a video to help them understand what it is that you want them to do. So these are anchor charts of visual directions. And so if you wanted a student to color, you might point to this word and say color. So then they know to use a crayon, or cut, or if they need to circle something or underline something. I always see newcomers, when you tell them to touch, like when you say touch the cat, they don't know what touch means. So that word, they don't know that vocabulary word yet. So you have to teach them to touch something or point to something, how to circle something or underline it. So this is an anchor chart that you could provide in your classroom. Okay, the next strategy is comprehension strategies. So comprehension strategies make learning, um, it helps the students learn in all content areas, in all classes, in all subjects. And in life, we use all of these skills every day, all day long, almost in everything that we do. So it's very important that we teach the students how to do it. And learning these skills starts at home, and then they continue to learn it in kindergarten, in first grade, third grade, all the way through high school. Okay, so students need explicit instruction and scaffolded support to use strategies such as problem solving, predicting, making inferences, organizing information, summarizing, categorizing, evaluating, and self monitoring. So we have to teach students how to use these comprehension strategies. And we want to teach students to be independent in using these comprehension strategies. And so we're going to scaffold support. So when they first learn to use the strategy, we're going to give them tons of support. And eventually, we want them to be able to access these strategies independently. Okay, so this is an anchor chart that lends itself to problem solving. So it says, what do mathematicians do when they get stuck on a math task? So instead of students just raising their hand and saying, I don't know how to do it, I'm stuck, or giving up, not doing any work, we're going to teach them to problem solve. We're going to teach them to use this anchor chart to not quit and to persevere. So that is problem solving is something that we have to intentionally teach students to do. Okay, this is a writing rubric, and rubrics teach students to evaluate their work. The thumbs up, thumbs to the side, thumbs down, that teaches students to evaluate things. They can tell their opinion about something, whether they liked it or they disliked it, and why. It's very important that students learn how to make inferences. They need to know how to put info together and come up with a conclusion that's not explicitly stated. And think about how often we use this skill. We use it in conversations, we use it when we are reading literature. Students have to learn how to make inferences. And then we teach them the vocabulary to be able to say, I made an inference. These are all tools that help support comprehension skills. They help support students being able to understand input. Okay, the next strategy is using visual cues in the classroom. And it's so powerful when you get to see something versus just hearing about it. So teachers provide support with pictures. Teachers provide support with realia. On the video that you watched earlier with the teacher that she brought in the tortilla press and the corn grinder, that goes a step beyond pictures. Instead of just looking at it in a picture, students got to actually touch it and see how it works. That's realia, it's real objects. Also, teachers could use gestures. We'll talk about TPR in a few slides. Graphic organizers are visual for students, and anchor charts. These are graphic organizers of fiction and nonfiction text. Okay, this goes with using gestures. Remember that we learned about total physical response in one of our beginning modules, but it associates physical movement um, to a word, and it basically helps to improve retention of the information. So one example that I use in my classroom is when we're learning about story elements and we learn about characters. So when I ask the students, what is a character? The students point to themselves and they say it's the people, and then they pretend they have antlers on the top of their head and animals, and then they do their hands like they're talking that talk, and then they make a book with their hands in a story. So when I say what is a character, then the kids would say the people and the animals that talk in a story. So they're using physical movement to remember the definition, and then they're able to apply that to a story. So when I give them an assignment and they have to work independently, if I say, draw the characters that were in this story, then I see kids in the classroom doing the gestures for the definition of characters, and it helps them recall the information. Okay, another way to improve comprehension in your classroom is to recycle and to reuse vocabulary words. This is a diagram of a polar bear, and an example that I pulled from here is a student learning the word fur, and then a student being able to use that vocabulary word and apply it to other situations. So then if there's another animal like a lion, they will call the hair on the lion fur. or the hair on a tiger, fur. And sometimes they might overgeneralize, but they're able to use their vocabulary word in different settings with different animals. And I really like this anchor chart. I actually had this in my classroom last year of power words. This is academic vocabulary, and students see this vocabulary across domains. So they might see the word, let's use the word predict, for example. They will see it in ELA. They'll also see that word in science. They might see it in social studies or math. And then they might be able to connect the word predict to the word hypothesis. And so it creates a web of information. And so it's really important to reuse that vocabulary over and over and over again. And it helps the students' comprehension. And so if they were to read a question on state testing that asks them to predict, because they've had so much experience with it, they'll know what it means. Okay. This next slide is quickly dedicated to culturally responsive teaching. Since we just learned about culturally responsive teaching last week, you want to make sure that your students are represented in your class. So you're going to use multicultural and bilingual text. That is not easy to do. Books are very expensive, so you probably would want to partner with some type of book club where you share books with your local library, with your school library, because it's important that students are represented in your classroom. And then it's also important that students learn about different cultures and that they learn to see each other's cultures as valuable. And they need to get that experience. And I'm sorry, they need to get the experience with other cultures. Also, you want to make accommodations for ELO students during classroom assessments. So we kind of talked about that when we did our assessments module, that this is kind of a scaffold for students. So you want to give them accommodations in your class, but as we know, there are not many accommodations on state assessments. And so basically, you want to provide them a lot of support and then eventually go to where they need no support or little support. Okay, the next component is interaction. So teachers need to mindfully monitor the interaction between teachers and students. So how much teacher talk time students are getting, how much student talk time they're getting, and also monitor the interaction between students. ELLs need opportunities to use language. They need that opportunity to practice what it is that they're learning. So they need to be able to practice using language. And if you don't give them talk time in class, they don't have time to practice. And interaction can be done in many ways between students. For instance, the students in my class know when I say turn and talk, they immediately know what to do. It's a routine in our classroom. Students can think, pair, share. This is very beneficial to English language learners because they have time to think first. This is wait time. So you're giving them time to think, and then they're able to turn to a partner and share. Also, it's the teacher's responsibility to monitor students' participation. So some students would be comfortable with never speaking and sitting and listening or tuning out the person that's talking. The teacher has to intentionally monitor that everybody is able to practice speaking. Everybody gets a chance to do that. Okay? And the more interaction students have, the more they have to practice negotiating meaning. And we know that language learning comes from negotiating meaning, being able to come to a common understanding and using language that works for both parties. Okay, component 6 is practice and application. So students need multiple opportunities to practice. and they need to practice in meaningful ways. Some ways that teachers make sure that students get a chance to practice is they might use this in their this model in their lesson plan to help them intentionally plan practice time. So it's I do, you do, I do, we do, you do. That's the one that I use in my lesson plan. This goes a step further. So each lesson the teacher models, that would be one, that's I do. And then we do, the teacher and the students do it together. And then you do, you work with a partner, that would incorporate interaction. And then independently, you work on your own. Okay, component 7 is lesson delivery. So you always want to make sure that you are actually monitoring the content and language objectives. Um, you wouldn't have a very successful lesson if you got to the end of the lesson and you never even covered the content objectives. Students didn't master what you set out for them to master. So you always want to make sure that you're monitoring that. Make sure that your lesson pace is appropriate to your students' ability. You want to make sure that you have bite-sized, concise objectives for the students. So last week when we talked about the WIDA lesson plan and using multiple objectives, when you do that, your lesson plan tends to not be appropriate because there's too much meat. You want to scale it back and have a specific objective, a specific target, and you monitor it. When students meet it, you move on to the next thing. Make sure you are monitoring the student engagement. Again, that all students are participating, all students are learning, all students are being challenged. You'll always have students that are lower, and so you'll have to provide them more support and scaffolds. And then you'll always have some students that are higher, so you will have to provide them enrichment. The last component is component 8, and that's kind of like the wrap up component, the review and assessment. So this is where you will assess the students and possibly you might have to adjust or you might have to reteach. Some of the wrap up techniques that I wanted to circle back to was revisiting the KWL, and that's when you would fill in the L column what the students learned. Okay, and you might teach students these sentence stems. I learned, or I still want to know, or I discovered. And even you might even have them evaluate and say, I still don't know. So what questions did they have that didn't get answered? And as always, you want to provide your students with feedback that helps you to reteach, it helps you to clarify, and then it helps you to correct misunderstandings. So the students may have misunderstood something, and so you want to provide them that correction, that feedback, and so they have a clear, comprehensible understanding. Okay, so that is all I have for you this week. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me and have a safe week.